because I want to talk about the boat migrant issue. Obviously, you've done several videos on this. 40,000, at least, it's probably over that now, have arrived in the UK this year. We have, hundreds of thousands of Brits sleeping rough on the streets, especially bad right now with this cold snap. Economic migrants being put up in 4- or 5-star hotels, majority being Albanian, a country not at war. Now we learned today, Richard, that, oh, by the way, they're putting them up in holiday camps now, like Butlins and Pontins. That's very nice for them. But we learned today that the government, they passed a law back in June which gave them the power to arrest anyone arriving in the UK without good reason or proper permission and jail them for 4 years. We find out today they've arrested a total of 0.3% of those boat migrants, despite giving themselves the powers to do it. I mean, can we feasibly call ourselves a proper country if we can't even enforce basic border controls?
I heard that the border force was going to go on strike, and I was thinking, well, that would be a relief because you won't be picking up people coming across.
That's what I thought, yeah. But no, there's still plenty of them for that. Don't worry about that.
Yeah, no. That's the bit they won't be striking on. Yes, it's a ridiculous and terrible issue, and Churchill would, of course, be spinning in his grave at the very idea that you could have an invasion of people who we are just welcoming, and in fact the taxi service bringing them in and putting them up. I used to entertain at Butlins many years ago, down at the one near me at Bognor, and the very idea that I would get a call now from an agent going, "Hey Richard, do you fancy going down and entertaining a few Bulgarians down at Butlins because they're a bit bored?" It's abhorrent. I don't know what we can do to prevent this because the government just does not seem willing. And what are we going to do with it? We're running out of places to put them. And we've got them in hotels, and now you say holiday camps. We're not arresting them, and yet clearly they are illegal immigrants. They're coming over in a way that's where it's 28 quid to fly over and go through the system. They're spending $5,000 to buy a rubber dinghy and come in groups and what have you. And if you and I want to go and see a GP, the easiest way now is to get a ferry to France, buy a rubber dinghy and come back and throw our phone and passport.
It's quicker than calling them up, probably.
Absolutely. You haven't got to fight the 8:30, trying to get through the officious secretary saying, no, we haven't got any appointments today. What do we do? It beggars belief, and you just think I just don't understand. I find myself exasperated, as so many Brits must do. And as you say, there's so many homeless, there's so many people who desperately need help, and we're all now being told, well, actually, put on a jumper. Don't turn your gas up because that's the way we'll fight Putin, is by not having to rely too much on the fuel. And yet, if you come over on this country illegally, we'll put you up in a nice cozy hotel with whatever temperature, every room has got its own little thermostat. So you can go, oh yes, I think I'll have about 22 because that reminds me what it's like in Albania or wherever I've come from. And maybe I'll go down on the tanning tables and do that. Who knows? Whereas, I mean, I don't have central heating in my house, so I burn logs because that's all I've got, and I don't have a huge supply of those. So I will put on a jumper, but that's not necessarily out of choice. It's there are plenty of people, and I read them in the comments on my videos of people saying, I want to have the heating on, I just can't afford it, and yet the resentment is growing.
It's incredible. And, Australia had a boat migrant crisis, and how they solved it was they intercepted the boats, took the migrants to a foreign country, which wasn't particularly nice to live in, and said, right, you wait here for 3 years while we process your asylum claim, and then if it's genuine, you can come to Australia. Suddenly, Richard, almost overnight, the migrants stopped getting on the boats in the first place. Funny coincidence that when you literally provide them with a red carpet taxi service and give them free healthcare, free money, free accommodation, they all want to come. Funny that, isn't it, when you incentivize it that way? But on a similar subject, Richard, what kind of impact has this rapid influx of mass migration had on the identity of the country? Because we had the census results a couple of weeks ago. 74.4% of people in England and Wales say they are white British. In England's three biggest cities, I found this shocking. Manchester, Birmingham and London, white British people are a minority in all those three cities. 1 in 6 people living in England and Wales were born abroad. How much have you noticed things change since when you were growing up and, throughout your childhood in the 60s, 70s and 80s as things were then with the identity, the makeup of the country, and as it is now with mass migration?
I live on the coast and I've been in the same house here for 31 years. And funnily enough, I very often take a little stroll down to the pier. It's very nice. And I was chatting to a chap who I just happened to bump into, and I said to him, the town's changed, doesn't it? And he said, do you think so? And I said, don't you? And he'd been around for about 20 years. And I said, oh, it's definitely changed. There's so many different types of nationality of people. Not that I'm... One finds oneself saying the same as everybody, as the politicians saying, which is, odd. I'm not against nationalities, but different people coming in and spending time here. And then once they've spent the time here, returning home or settling and being part of the English or the British culture and being integrated into it instead of getting into enclaves. And you look at London. I used to go up to London as a child. You'd see the Cockneys and hear the wonderful vernacular that they would be speaking. And now they're just no-go areas for me, or I feel like that. Of a certain age, you start getting a bit nervous because every shop is no longer an English or a British shop. And, you look out and there's people from different parts of the world. And one of the great things about the world and people being in different parts of the world is it makes it fascinating when you go to somebody else's culture and you in a different part of the world and you see how they live and you understand why they live because of the country, the geology, the weather. All these things will depict how they and why they exist the way they do, which makes it absolutely wonderful to go traveling if you've got the money to do that. But when it's all one big melting pot and everybody's in these little enclaves, which is what they are now, there is no sense that this country has its identity. It's been slipping away on and on. We spoke about the architecture, the people now, the government, the way the government is manipulating everything, the population growth. I used to make corporate videos for a living at one time, and I'd very often book a hotel somewhere and stay in the hotel, and the stuff I did was quite boring, but I would see the town and you'd walk around the town. It would be fascinating to see different parts of England, and I kept thinking to myself, well, I must go here and do some filming here myself. It's so lovely. But now I don't know what people do about booking hotels because the hotels are all taken over by huge groups of one type of person, which must be quite fearful for people. Yes, I've seen it. I've seen the national identity change. At one time, you were very proud to be a member of this country. You were proud of its history. You grew up, when I grew up I was born in the 60s, and in the 70s was my sort of educational time. And the history lessons and the geography lessons where you're learning about towns and market towns, and you'd see these wonderful quintessentially English towns with their Elizabethan timber frame buildings and Georgian buildings, and you learned about how the farming communities and the hierarchy that built up these lovely villages, and then the market towns, and how everybody was basically serving one another, and you all got on. People would speak the same language over the garden fence. You could go down to the town and moan about what they were doing in the next town. Places would be playing football with one another, and you had so much shared interest, so much shared culture. You could go anywhere and almost talk to anybody about a subject, and everybody would know what you're talking about. Now, when you travel about, you just feel that you're always on tenterhooks, that you can't say something in case it upsets somebody. You don't know what their nationality is. And if you ask them, oh, but where are you from? Now, of course, we know from the debacle with Lady Hussey that's, just asking somebody where you're from has become a political football. And it is deplorable. And I just don't think it's wrong to say, I want my country back. I want it back. It's happened so fast. It's the rapidity of it. It's
that's it, yeah.
It's just, and I mean, you're clearly younger than I am. And I think the millennial people who are born, my children, for example, they don't know any different. And I'm of that age where I still have one foot in the analog world, where people got on and communities existed, and one foot in this digital world where it is more ghettoized. And
exactly, yeah.
It's and the thing is, I think my children have no concept of the cohesion and the marvelous time. And the trouble is, all old people are going to say, it was great in my day when I was younger, because things have moved on. But I just think now it's moved on so quickly that people can't even conceive the freedoms. You used to be able to run around the fields and go off on your bikes, and you weren't worried. You weren't scared every minute that there was a sexual pest who was going to come after you. You weren't worried that there were people tweeting and or texting you or manipulating you or tracking you or spying on you or stopping you from doing things. The freedoms that you had to just exist and learn from your mistakes and bloody your knees and fall out of trees and all this sort of stuff that you had. Now we don't stand up for ourselves anymore. The government, we turn to the government. There was a friend of mine sent me a video of a bloke in a car today who was going, oh, it's outrageous, there's snow on the roads, where's the government? Why aren't they cleaning the street? And I thought, why haven't you got a spade in the back of your car, mate? Why aren't you just digging it out of the way? Do something. People should be standing up for themselves. But that spirit seems to have gone, that we're just too weak and we've become like jelly now and going, oh, wait for the government to come and sort us out. And we need to grow a pair, get some backbone again.
People really are getting more feckless and lazier. A part of that obviously was with the furlough payments with COVID. If the government literally pays your wage for the best part of the year, then you're going to become more dependent on government. And again, as you mentioned with the immigration thing, the sheer scale of it means you can never integrate that number of people because they're coming in far too quickly and the process is just too fast. And the point about it is, you said it, they ghettoize. There's no such thing as multiculturalism because everybody ghettoizes into their own little communities, mainly based on either religious or ethnic, quotient. So,
and you can't blame them. You see, that's the thing. You can't blame them for doing that because if hundreds of Brits went to another thing and they didn't know the language or they didn't know the culture, you would do the same, which is a reason for not having a number of people coming in one go.
Well, exactly. I mean, you go to Benidorm and it's full of Brits in there having full English breakfasts and drinking in Irish pubs, obviously. So it happens across the world. But we're supposed to sustain the brunt of it from all corners of the world. And the point about it is the ghettoization occurs at both the top and bottom levels, both poor and rich. I lived in tower blocks in central London where you would have rich Americans, you would have rich Chinese, you would have rich Russians, you would have rich Arabs all living in the same building. They all hang out in their own communities. You don't talk to them. You don't talk to each other. I had an American neighbor, literally right next door in this apartment block. I was living there for a year, never said one word to them. I moved out here back to the countryside again, to a village. I know my neighbours. I talk to my neighbours every time I see them. So it obliterates communities. So-called diversity and multiculturalism obliterates communities and it obliterates diversity because there's nothing distinct anymore. It's like you said, Richard, even as a kid in the late 80s, early 90s, when I went abroad to, say, Portugal or Spain, it was a genuinely novel experience. It was like almost going to a different planet the first time I went to a country like Portugal or Spain. Now you go there, everything's the same. It's corporate, it's bland. This same global homogenization has taken over Europe, it's taken over America. The only places you go now where you think, oh my God, this is like landing on an alien planet, is when you go to places like Japan, like China, where they have their own culture, they have their own distinct identity, and diversity obliterates that. It doesn't create multiculturalism, it obliterates authentic cultures everywhere it goes. And another point you raised was the population growth. You know, again, we've got it above and below. Rich Russians, Arabs, Americans moving into London, kicking out the local population. They're supposed to build affordable homes when they build these giant steel and glass tower blocks. They never do. They're never affordable. Those people get kicked out. And below, the economic migrants move in. They get given free accommodation in many cases. The native population gets kicked out, more homeless people on the street. And, you know, it's starting to impact the quality of life in the countryside. This constant population increase is leading to more and more of these bland, identikit, new build estates being built on farms and Greenland. And you've talked about that in your videos as well, haven't you?
One of the things I find absolutely, for me, is a complete red line is building on farmland. We've had farmland in this country. I mean, food is the most important thing. And we've seen so many times when we've had to we have outsourced a lot of food. It may be that we need to outsource the production of food, and we bring it in because it's a bit cheaper because we've got so many people. But we want to be as self-reliant as we possibly can to build these, as you say, these awful prison camp-like houses is what they look to me. They're just, as you say, identikit, horrible rabbit hutches, which cost an absolute fortune for people, and mostly they're not first-time buyers places either. And funnily enough, I had a viewer of mine who bought one of these places and said, look, I don't want to say anything on your show, but I bought one of these places and we're very happy. And I said, well, that's up to you, of course. And then about a year later, they were outraged because they bought this place in this lovely village. This whole load of new builds had gone up, and they were in one of the new builds. And then a year later, there were more new builds, which was opposite them. And they were outraged that these new builds had come. And they said, but we were told that they would never build in that field.
There's actually a meme on Twitter, Richard, of it's a new build housing estate, and then there's a big patch of grass in front of the houses, and they've got a placard up, a sign up saying no to new builds. It's literally, well, that was you.
Yeah, absolutely. And so to go back to the farmland thing, but we need that farmland. This is, it's so important that we are able to grow. If we have food shortages in the rest of the world, we had to resort to it in both wars, particularly the Second World War with the Dig for Victory, where people were literally growing stuff on all sorts of bits of old land, trying to bring. And you had the war agricultural boys coming in telling farmers what to grow, and if they didn't grow it and they weren't productive, they would take that farm away from the farmer because it was so important. And we're just ignoring all of that, and we're building rubbish houses that nobody ever wants to go. You think, where do the tourists go? They go to lovely places like Shrewsbury, where you've got beautiful Elizabethan timber-framed houses, Georgian houses. People want to see the old. They're not going to tour around some new estate in 50 or 100 years' time because these prison camps or these in my videos I've gone round some old Victorian asylum places where they've got these things, and some of these places, these new builds, just look like asylums. They all look the same. It looks like some massive hospital camp. And my childhood place was we lived in a cul-de-sac, and on the back of my house there was farmland. And when I was a kid, there was a farm in this old farmhouse, and we used to steal the beetroots and put them on a trolley and knock on the doors and try and sell these things ourselves to make a few pennies. And then the farmer died. The place went to rack and ruin, so it became our playground. We used to clamber about on the roof and chuck the slates about and all this sort of stuff. And I went back about 3 or 4 years ago. It's all been built on my whole childhood experiences. In the fields that we used to dig up old bottles and clay pipe stems from, I don't know, the Victorian period, 200 or 300 years ago. And you knew that somebody was there with a horse and plough, ploughing that field for years and years. And now it'd never be ploughed again. It's all been built on. And the food that came out of that fed the community, and the employment that farm used to bring will never happen again. And it will all be those middle-class people with their big cars, and just one car, because there was nowhere else for anyone to park. And actually, if you parked on the street, you were fined. This is madness. This is total madness.
And it's this idea that we constantly need to have a forever ballooning, increasing population. We don't. And there are other countries that have set an example. I mean, you can look at the Czech Republic, which, you know, despite its suffering through communist occupation for many years, has a high standard of living. It's a nice place to live. They have great architecture. The population of the Czech Republic in 1900 was 9.3 million people. Now, in 2022, it's 10.5 million people, and it's always been in that range for 120 years, between 8.5 and 10.5 million people. Their population is 95% ethnically, linguistically Czech. You don't need to have mass immigration to have a basic, comfortable, high quality of living. There are countries that have proven you don't need to import vast numbers of people constantly to remain, you know, economically prosperous and sacrifice your entire identity, your country in the process. Get early access to videos, exclusive live streams, and personally DM me. You've seen how much I get demonetized all the time. Well, this is how you support me, by subscribing at pauljosephwatson.locals.com. Please click the link in the description.